The humble nurse made the sick millionaire smile, not knowing that her son was looking at her, and fell in love. The air in the private ward was scented faintly of fresh lilies, a silent promise of life in a place where death often lingered in the corners. Eleanor moved with the quiet grace of someone accustomed to sorrow, but never conquered by it. Her crisp uniform rustled softly as she adjusted the pillows beneath Mr. Hartley's head, her gentle hands betraying no fear of the frailty that threatened to consume him. The millionaire's pale lips curved upward, a rare smile that had become almost as precious to the nurses as his generous donations. "You are too kind to an old man," he rasped, voice edged with exhaustion but warm with gratitude. She dipped the corner of a cloth into cool water and brushed it lightly over his forehead. "Kindness costs nothing, Mr. Hartley," she whispered, her eyes luminous with sincerity. "Besides, you've made everyone here feel appreciated." Outside the glass wall that separated the patient's suite from the hallway, Adrian watched in silence. He'd come to see his mother between lectures, planning only to leave her a note and a thermos of the chamomile tea she adored. But the moment he saw her bent over the ailing man, compassion written in every line of her posture, something shifted in him. It wasn't merely admiration. It was the dawning ache of a feeling he had only read about in novels, an inexplicable pull toward the woman whose spirit shone brighter than the sterile fluorescent lights. Eleanor tucked the blanket under Mr. Hartley's arms and straightened, unaware of her son's gaze, unaware that in this quiet act of mercy she was altering two lives at once. Later that evening, as twilight fell across the city and the hospital corridors emptied, Adrian waited outside the ward. The door opened with a soft sigh, and she stepped into the hallway, looking as weary as she was dignified. "Mom," he called, his voice low, hesitant. She startled, but when she saw him, her face softened. "Adrian, what are you doing here so late?" "I wanted to see you," he said honestly, holding up the thermos. "You've been working too hard again." Her smile was tired but genuine. "You know me too well." They sat together on a narrow bench near the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. The hush between them felt almost sacred. Adrian studied her profile, the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the curve of her mouth, and felt a pang of wonder. "Is he going to be all right?" he asked quietly, nodding toward the ward. Eleanor sighed. "His heart is failing, but his spirit is strong. Sometimes that's enough." There was something luminous about the way she said it, as if she were sharing a secret about how to endure the impossible. Adrian felt something tighten in his chest, a mixture of admiration and yearning he didn't fully understand. The following day, Eleanor arrived at the hospital before dawn. Mr. Hartley was already awake, propped against his pillows with a book in hand. He looked up when she entered, and his smile came quicker this time, less like a courtesy and more like genuine delight. "You always bring the morning with you," he said. She shook her head, embarrassed by the compliment. "Nonsense. I'm just a nurse." "You're more than that," he insisted, his voice thin but fervent. "You are hope when the world seems bleak." For a moment she didn't know what to say. She had never considered herself anything special. She was simply doing her duty, day after day, comforting those who needed comfort, never imagining she was leaving a mark on anyone's life. Unseen by them both, Adrian had arrived early again, standing behind the tinted glass. He couldn't tear his eyes away from her. It struck him that her entire existence was an offering, to her patients, to her colleagues, to him. At the university, he found himself unable to concentrate. His classmates discussed theories of ethics and the frameworks of leadership, but all he could think of was her. Her hands folded over Mr. Hartley's, the calm in her voice, the way she believed that a gentle touch could ease any pain. By evening, he was back at the hospital, walking the corridors with a restless urgency he couldn't name. He paused outside Mr. Hartley's door, his hand hovering over the knob. Part of him wondered if it was right to intrude, but something told him that this was no ordinary moment. Inside, Eleanor was reading aloud. Her voice floated through the half-open door like a hymn, soft and sure. "And in the end," she read, "it was not wealth or power that defined a man, but the love he left behind." Mr. Hartley's eyes were closed, tears glistening on his cheeks. Adrian stepped back, heart thudding. He had never seen such quiet devotion. And in that instant he knew. The feeling that had rooted itself inside him was not simply love for a woman. It was love for everything she represented: compassion, humility, a faith that goodness still mattered. When Eleanor finally emerged, she startled again to find him waiting. "You're here," she said, her voice hushed with surprise. "I couldn't stay away," Adrian admitted. I don't think I ever will. She searched his face for the meaning in his words, and for a moment, he thought she might have guessed the truth. But she only smiled, cupped his cheek with her palm, and whispered, You've always had the kindest heart. Neither of them noticed Mr. Hartley watching from the doorway, his expression tender and wistful. In the stillness that followed, something unspoken passed between all three of them. A recognition that in this place where endings were inevitable, there were also beginnings waiting to be found. Mr. Hartley's gaze lingered on the pair as they stood in the hallway, the dim light haloing Eleanor's hair in a way that made her look almost ethereal. He had lived long enough to recognize the fragile beginnings of love, the way it softened a person's voice and made their silences more meaningful. He felt an ache in his own chest that had nothing to do with the weakness of his heart and everything to do with the knowledge that he would never again stand in the threshold of such possibility. Yet somehow, instead of bitterness, he felt a stirring of peace. Eleanor turned, sensing his eyes on her. She stepped back into the room, her hand still lightly touching Adrian's sleeve as if reluctant to let go. Is everything all right? She asked gently. Mr. Hartley nodded, though he could hardly trust his voice. Everything is more than all right, he managed. You remind me that life is still worth noticing. Her lips parted, startled by the depth of his sincerity. Before she could answer, Adrian crossed the threshold behind her, as if drawn by some invisible tether he no longer wished to deny. Mr. Hartley, Adrian began, his voice low but steady, I'm sorry if I've intruded these past days. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. The old man's eyes glimmered, a thin smile playing across his mouth. Son, if there is one thing I've learned with what time I have left, it is that you should never apologize for showing up when it matters. Eleanor looked between them, her heart folding inward around a sudden tenderness that made her throat tight. I think he's right, she whispered. Sometimes just being here is all someone needs. Adrian held her gaze a moment longer, searching for the words to tell her everything he felt. How watching her had changed the shape of his ambitions, how he had begun to measure success not in accolades, but in quiet acts of kindness, how her presence illuminated a part of him he'd never known was waiting to be woken. But he found that nothing he might say could capture the truth without sounding inadequate. So instead, he simply moved to Mr. Hartley's bedside, drawing up a chair without asking, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And in that small, simple act, Eleanor felt something profound take root. Over the next week, Adrian came to the hospital every day. At first, he told himself he was only there to support his mother, to offer her the same unwavering care she gave everyone else. But as the days unfolded, the lie unraveled. He came for her, her quiet strength, her unassuming grace, the way she believed that no gesture was ever too small to be meaningful. He brought her tea, slipped handwritten notes into her pocket when she wasn't looking, and sat with Mr. Hartley long after visiting hours had ended, reading aloud from the old man's favorite histories. At first, Eleanor tried to protest, worried he was sacrificing too much of himself, but each time she voiced her concern, Adrian met her with that same steady calm. I'm exactly where I should be, he'd tell her, and something in his voice always silenced her protests. One evening, rain streaked the tall windows of the hospital lobby in silver rivulets. Eleanor emerged from the ward, her shoulders sagging with fatigue. Adrian was waiting, as always, a book in one hand and an umbrella in the other. I thought you might like a ride home, he said, holding the umbrella aloft as if it were a shield against the encroaching darkness. She hesitated, glancing back toward Mr. Hartley's room. The old man was sleeping peacefully, his breathing steady for the first time in days. She looked at Adrian, her heart tipping in her chest. You're too good to me, she murmured, her voice husky. You taught me how, he replied simply. They walked side by side through the rain, the umbrella sheltering them in a little world of their own. Eleanor felt the warmth of him at her side and wondered how she had ever thought she was alone. She wondered if he understood that his kindness was the one thing she hadn't known she needed until it was offered freely, without expectation. At her front door, she paused, reluctant to break the quiet that had settled between them. The porch light flickered, illuminating the fine lines around her eyes, the tender uncertainty in her expression. Adrian, she began, her voice barely more than a whisper. I don't know what all of this means. He reached out and brushed a raindrop from her cheek, his touch as reverent as it was certain. It doesn't have to mean anything right now, he said. We'll figure it out. All I know is that you've spent your life caring for everyone else, and I'd like the chance to care for you. Her eyes shimmered, and for a moment she couldn't find the words. In the end, she didn't need them. She stepped forward, resting her forehead lightly against his shoulder, her breath trembling against the fabric of his coat. Inside the house, the clock ticked steadily on the mantel. She thought of all the years she had spent measuring her worth by what she could give others, never imagining that someone might see her not as a nurse or as a mother, but as a woman worthy of love. When she finally drew back, she searched his face, as if memorizing the quiet conviction she found there. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" he asked, his voice rough around the edges. "For showing me that maybe it's not too late to let someone in." He smiled, brushing another raindrop from her hair, and in that moment, she knew something had begun that neither of them yet understood, but both were willing to trust. The rain passed in the night, leaving the world washed clean by morning. Soft golden light spilled across Eleanor's kitchen as she stood by the window, watching droplets slide down the glass. It had been years since she'd woken with her heart so full it ached. She pressed her palm to her chest, as if to steady the feeling. In the quiet, she heard Adrian's laughter in her memory, the way he'd looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, like she was something precious. She had spent so long believing her life was already decided, the best of it behind her. Yet here she was, standing at the threshold of a future she hadn't dared to imagine. At the hospital, Mr. Hartley's condition had stabilized. Eleanor returned to work that morning to find him sitting upright, a quilt over his knees, a small stack of letters in his lap. He looked up as she entered, and for the first time, his smile reached every corner of his weary face. "You're early," she teased softly, setting down her bag. "I couldn't sleep," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "I was thinking about all the things I never said to the people I cared for. About how easy it is to let time slip away until you wake up and realize you've squandered the chance to love anyone at all." She drew closer, resting a hand on the edge of his bed. "You've loved more than you know. You've helped more people than you can count." He studied her face, his eyes damp. "Perhaps," he murmured, "but watching you and that young man, it reminded me that love is the one thing that refuses to wait politely. It shows up when it wants, demands to be seen." Her breath caught. He reached for her hand and squeezed it gently. "Don't waste it," he whispered. "Promise me you'll let yourself be happy." She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. That afternoon, Adrian arrived with a paper bag of pastries and the smallest bouquet of daisies she had ever seen. He held them out with a sheepish grin. "I know you don't like roses," he said. "Too fussy." Her laugh was soft and astonished. She had never told him that. He had simply noticed, the way he noticed everything about her. "You remembered," she breathed. "I remember everything," he said, and she believed him. They sat together on the bench outside the ward, the daisies between them, the air warm with something unspoken. He told her about his classes, about the professor who had pulled him aside to say he seemed changed. She listened, her heart swelling with pride and something deeper, something she no longer felt the need to deny. In the evenings, she began to leave the hospital a little earlier. Some nights, she and Adrian would walk along the river where the city lights danced in the water, their hands brushing until one of them dared to close the space between. She found herself laughing more, waking each morning with a lightness that felt both unfamiliar and undeniable. She was no longer simply the nurse who eased the passing of strangers. She was a woman rediscovering her own capacity for joy. As summer ripened, Mr. Hartley's health began to fade again. But this time, there was no fear in him, no bitterness. He would watch them together, Adrian reading aloud, Eleanor resting her cheek against Adrian's shoulder, and he would smile with a tenderness that made Eleanor's eyes sting. One late afternoon, when the sky had turned the color of apricots, Mr. Hartley beckoned Eleanor close. She sat beside him, her hand enfolding his. "I've spent decades believing my wealth could shield me from regret," he murmured. "But the truth is, the only thing I wish for now is more time to love someone as fiercely as you do." Her heart twisted. "You've loved in your own way," she whispered. He nodded slowly. "But you," his breath caught, and for a moment she thought he would not go on. Then he managed a thin, determined smile. "You showed me that kindness can be more powerful than fortune, that it can heal things no doctor ever could." Tears blurred her vision. She leaned forward and kissed his brow, her voice a trembling promise. "I will never forget you." His last breath came with a sigh that sounded almost like relief. They held a memorial in the small hospital chapel, a quiet gathering of the staff and a handful of friends. Adrian stood at Eleanor's side, his arm around her waist, his presence steady as a heartbeat. As the eulogies ended, she looked up at him, her eyes luminous with sorrow and gratitude. "He changed me," she whispered. Adrian nodded, brushing her hair back from her cheek. "He changed both of us." They walked out into the warm afternoon, the scent of lilies lingering behind them. For a moment, Eleanor closed her eyes and let the sun soak into her skin. She thought of all the nights she had spent wondering if she was wasting her life in service to others. All the mornings she had woken alone, believing there would never be more. But here, in the hush after goodbye, she felt something like certainty. She turned to Adrian, her hand sliding into his. "I don't know where this will go," she said softly. "Neither do I," he admitted, smiling. "But we're here. That's enough." She tipped her face up to kiss him, a kiss that tasted of salt and hope and everything she had thought she'd lost. When they parted, she saw the future shining in his eyes. Not a promise of perfection, but of something real, something worth choosing every day. In that moment, she understood what Mr. Hartley had meant. Love does not wait politely. It arrives unannounced, stubborn and miraculous, demanding to be claimed. And sometimes, if you are brave enough to answer, it gives back more than you ever dared to imagine.